she mentioned the B word, belonging, okay? And that's something that I talk about. There's no point doing all these amazing things if you don't feel like you belong within an organization, right? Because you're not going to stay.
We know that racism and discrimination is systematically baked into the way that we work and the way that our communities operate. And I think it's a really important thing to acknowledge, because all the good intention in the world actually cannot translate to change if we're not willing to unpack the systems that keep us stuck where we are.
Equality, everybody does the same thing. You get an M&M, you get an M&M, and you get an M. Or equity is getting what you need. So instead of giving 3 people M&Ms, maybe you know one person is a diabetic, so you're not going to give them an M&M. So it's really understanding what that person needs and providing them what they need.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Work panel by cakedotcom. My name is Julian Griffin, and today we will be discussing a very important topic for business, leadership, and the workplace worldwide, which is DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We'll be taking a deep dive into this subject and reflect on how DE&I has made an impact in 2023 and what we can look forward to in 2024. Today, I have 3 very special guests with me. We have founder of Allyship and Inclusive, based in London, England, Chikere Igbokwe. Chikere, how are you doing?
Really well, Julian. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Next, we have the founder and co-director of Human Leaders and host of Human Leaders podcast based in Sydney, Australia, Alexis Zahner. Alexis, tell us, how are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here and to dive into this conversation together. So thanks for inviting me along.
And last but certainly not least, we have the founder of Elevated Diversity, based in Los Angeles, California. We have Rhonda Moret. Rhonda, how are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thanks so much. Excited to be here as well. And I'm excited to share thoughts on DEI. So thank you.
Of course. Okay, so of course, thank you all so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. So before we get into it, just for our audience, if you wouldn't all mind telling us about your organizations and just letting them get to know you and what your organizations are about. So Chikere, why don't you start us off telling about Allyship and Inclusive?
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everyone. And again, thank you so much for having me. I am the founder of Inclusive and also allyship.com. .co.uk. I think for me, I come from a talent acquisition background and I was born in the United Kingdom. In terms of my heritage, I think my heritage really did set me up to do the work that I do. I am extremely passionate about what I do. I think for me, it's more than just a job. So I was born on the south coast of England to a West Indian mother and a Nigerian father. So in terms of my heritage, my grandmother was part of the Windrush generation. So some of you may have heard of it. It's the Windrush generation were a lot of the Caribbean people who came to the United Kingdom. They were invited after the Second World War to come and help rebuild motherland. So my grandmother, she came over with my mother. She worked for the NHS as a nurse and she died in Southampton. So I was born in Southampton, and my father is Nigerian, hence my name, and he came over on a scholarship and met my mother, and I guess the rest is history. And I always, I think for me, I always credit the bravery of my grandmother for coming over, because at the end of the day, how would my Nigerian father have met my Caribbean mother? I would never have been born. And I grew up in Southampton, so Southampton is where the Titanic set sail, and it was very, not a diverse place at all. So I was at school, I was always the only child who looked like me. And I think coming to London to go to university, London, for those of you who've been to London, it's an amazing city. It's full of everyone. And I was just so excited to be in such a great city, diverse city. And after university, I fell into recruitment. And I used to recruit very, very senior HR professionals for a number of sectors. And when I did recruitment, I noticed that HR was full of amazing women, right? However, when I would go on a client visit to see an HR leader, very rarely would I see a woman in position of power and influence. And I really questioned that. And living in such a diverse city, very rarely would I see anyone who looked like me and was like, what is going on? I need to do something. But this was like in the 90s, like late 90s, early 2000s. So when we spoke about diversity, rightly so, we spoke about gender, but that was it. We didn't speak about anything else. So as you can imagine, talking about race was really, really difficult. And it was only during the pandemic, when we had the murder of George Floyd and all the other murders that we've heard, that people really started to have that conversation around diversity. But because I always had that conversation, I think for me it was something that was always really, really important. That was when I had a lot of my clients and candidates reaching out to me saying, Chikere, what can we do? So allyship was born first and foremost. So allyship is key for allies to come together in a safe and brave space and have those really important conversations. And off the back of that, I realized that as allies, myself included, there's no point having these conversations if we're not educating ourselves. That's where the book club was born. And that's what you can see behind me. I'm quite lucky that I've got the time to read. And then off the back of that, Inclusive was born. And Inclusive is my diversity consultancy. And, I help organizations create inclusive cultures where everyone can feel their true, authentic self. So lots of education, lots of action, lots of allyship, anti-racism, that kind of thing. And as I mentioned to you, for me, it's much more than a job. Okay. It's something I'm extremely passionate about. So that's just what I do in a nutshell.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That's beautiful. I love to hear that. I love to hear that we have our people really working towards making sure that we are seen and that we are heard. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for that, Chikere. So Alexis, please tell us about human leaders. I'm excited to hear about this.
Yeah, absolutely. So human leaders, I guess, was really born out of a need to help leaders evolve from the inside out. That's really the premise of what we do. We believe that we're all human first and leaders second, and that by developing ourselves, both our internal and external self-awareness, things like our communication skills, and our capacity to lead others from that really human first place, that we can actually achieve better outcomes in the workplace, be it diversity, equity, and inclusion outcomes, a sense of belonging, but then also some of the harder business metrics that organizations find really important, and that is, the bottom line measurements as well. So we know now that people perform better when they're engaged, when they feel a sense of belonging, when they feel safety in the workplace, and they feel like their contributions are valid and they're seen and heard. So we really work with leaders to develop themselves so they actually have the capacity to create workspaces where that's possible. So I guess the quick background on me. I grew up in Australia, grew up in regional Australia, so very blue collar background. I most certainly from a DEI perspective did not see a lot of women, especially in boardrooms or in positions of any kind of power growing up. I come from a background where my mom's a cleaner and my dad's an electrician. So I was the first female to go to university in my family, believe it or not, even though that was only 15 odd years ago. So it's been an exciting path in discovering myself and the value and contribution through which I can serve the world. And the work that I'm doing now is really born out of a really tough run, I think, in corporate graduate roles through to my late 20s and feeling really unfulfilled and unseen and unvalued myself in work. And then I took a chance opportunity to work at Patagonia in Canada. In my first leadership job, and it really drastically changed my perception of what work could be and how it could enable us to feel like we can contribute to the world around us. So from that day forward, I vowed to never work for an organization again that sucked the soul out of me. And since then,
I love to hear that.
Yeah, I really wanted to work with leaders and organizations to make sure that other human beings don't have that experience either. So we don't do diversity, equity, and inclusion work directly. That's something we always work with DEI experts to do because we know that's not our expertise per se. However, we do know that leadership is an enabler for people to understand the value of these things and want to have these things in their organization, and also the capacity for them to actually cultivate things like connection and empathy for everyone in their workplace. So that's me, and that's our work in a nutshell. And I'm really excited to learn from the two wonderful women we have here today sharing their expertise as well. So thanks for having me again.
We're happy to have you. And as a fellow millennial, that really does speak to me, because I've worked some people that worked me to death, and I didn't feel like I belonged. So looking at your organization and looking at the work you do, it's a beautiful thing that you're doing, that you're helping us out and having us create better leaders for us and training us to be better leaders. So that's beautiful. It's beautiful to hear.
Yeah.
All right. Rhonda, please, with your vast resume. We're looking at your resume. You've done a lot. It's beautiful to see. Please tell us about.
Like I'm really old.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You've just done so much. You've done so much for us. Please tell us about Elevated Diversity. Please tell us.
And I just kid with you, but thank you so much. Yes, I'm the founder of Elevated Diversity. We are a DEI consulting and training organization. We've been around for almost 8 years now. But like the other fellow panelists, my story and why I sit here today is based on those years of experience working in different environments. I spent probably a good 20 years working in the golf industry. So I worked for brands like PGA of America, PGA Tour, Nike Golf. And inevitably, not only was I the only woman in the room, but I was always the only person of color in the room. And after year after year after year, I just felt like, okay, why isn't the industry doing more to bring Black and brown people to the game? And that was part of what I was trying to do, but I just felt like I was hitting a wall over and over again. Even one of my trips to a golf club, I was there with my male counterparts, and we were there for some function. And right outside of the doorway, it said "gentlemen only," and I thought, "Oh my God, it's 2000 something," and it said "gentlemen only." So I wasn't allowed to go into this room. I was like, "Is this for real? Is this right?" And I wasn't allowed in. So that brought me to where I am today. Just like the other panelists, there's a passion here, and I'm sure as with others, each and every day we're trying to create that level of awareness that now is incredibly necessary for us to begin to make impact and for us to begin to see real meaningful change take place. So that's a bit about my extended background, as you say.
Oh, thank you so much. But it really does sound like, and then reading about what you've done, it sounds like coming from the outside looking in, of course, me being a man, it's hard for me to understand this, and it's beautiful that I'm hearing about this, and so much of our audience is able to hear that new perspective, especially a lot of us men. So thank you so much for just giving me that perspective, and it's beautiful. Thank you all so much for telling me about your stories, about your organizations. So let's jump right into it, shall we?
Let's
do it. So of course, like, we've seen some like very radical changes in the workplace, like since post-COVID, especially here in 2023. We've seen a lot of stuff happening in the workplace. And so along with it, of course, regarding DE&I, like we see it a lot more. So my question to you all is, like, what are some things that you've seen to make you hopeful, or some things that you've seen in 2023 as far as what practices organizations are adopting, and how does it make you hopeful for 2024? Alexis, let's start with Rhonda. Let's start with you.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. Let me answer first, because the thing that I am most excited about, and it's interesting, we'll receive calls from individuals. Often they're very young and newer in their career, so they'll say, "Hey, I just want some help. I need to find a way to convince our leadership that we need to develop some type of DEI strategy or initiative that all of us can be brought to the table." I find that hopeful, in that I really, really believe that this next generation is so much more aware, so much more clued in than the previous generations. And they realize the importance of having diversity, and they don't see it as, okay, so you're different than me. It's like, yeah, you're different than me. What, tell me about yourself. Let me learn
That's
from
beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is the one thing that always pops to the top of my mind. And I keep thinking that we're going to be okay. It's going to take time, but we will get there eventually.
I love that.
Thank you.
I love that.
Thank you for that.
I'll tell you why I love that, because what you've just mentioned, they're my children's friends. They're my son's friends. And they're the next generation, right? They're Generation Z, Generation Z. And you are right, they are having braver and bolder conversations. And I've seen the same thing happen, because remember, they are the next generation who are going into organizations. So gone are the days when we cannot have these really important conversations. So I've seen the same thing. And I've also seen, I've written just a few things down, but I don't want to forget what I was going to say. There is a priority. I've noticed there is a priority, right? And I think a lot of organizations are realizing we have to try and make sure we talk about everything, okay? Not just, for example, gender, right? Rightly so, we need to keep talking about gender, but we need to start having braver and bolder conversations whereby we're talking about race and sexual orientation and everything else. So I've noticed that. I've also noticed the need for that education, okay? That foundational education. I've done so much this year that I feel broken at the moment. So just that it's almost like big global organizations just beginning to have the conversation around diversity. It's like, don't you know this already? So it's not a case of, why are we having this conversation, okay? And even just looking at terminology. So we all have bias, and we're talking about privilege, including white privilege and microaggressions and allyship and what next, and trying to get people and organizations to realize you've got to do the work. You've got to be intentional. And I really love what Alexis was mentioned, she mentioned the B word, belonging, okay? And that's something that I talk about. There's no point doing all these amazing things if you don't feel like you belong within an organization, right? Because you're not going to stay. You're not going to stay. So yeah, there's just a lot happening that has been happening this year. So
And to your point, just normalizing, and I think you referred to it as bold conversations. I mean, years ago, especially here in the States, you couldn't talk about race or religion or politics in the workplace. And now it's like, bring it on, because it's important to be able, instead of shying away from those topics, let's learn from each other. Let's put it on the table and let's start having conversations, meaningful conversations.
I agree. Actually.
Of course. Alexis, give us some insight. What do you think?
Absolutely. I just want to, I really resonate with both of those points. And to that point, interestingly, we had a conversation recently with Harvard professor Michelle Lamont, who's a sociologist in this subject, and she was exploring her research with us from her new book, and she was reiterating that point. In fact, she was saying that at a societal level, it appears that younger generations are really redefining what value means to them as well. And she was suggesting that because, these historic dreams, such as, the great Australian dream, we call it, or perhaps it's the great American dream, owning your home and doing these kinds of things by a certain age. From my generation, millennials and younger, that's obviously shifted because of sort of market forces and whatnot. And so she was explaining that Gen Z and younger are really looking at prioritizing inclusion actually as a way of living, in a way that our community should be functioning. So I think the shift is so profound, in fact, that we're seeing this so far beyond the workplace, which I just wanted to say that I really resonate. I think that's a really important place for us to be heading. And I guess to something that I'm really witnessing in the work that we do. We collaborate with the Center for Work Time Reduction, so really looking at the systems that underpin how we work as well. And I must say that there's certainly a big behavioral component to the DEI piece. We have to have people mindset and behavior changing. But we know that racism and discrimination is systematically baked into the way that we work and the way that our communities operate. And I think it's a really important thing to acknowledge, because all the good intention in the world actually cannot translate to change if we're not willing to unpack the systems that keep us stuck where we are. So the work that we're doing in collaboration with these places is really important, because we're seeing things like hybrid work, allowing people to work in a structured way. So this is very different from flexible work, where we're in fact kind of loading people up and not putting structure around what that looks like. Things like intentional hybrid work, where there's really clear parameters around when people are at home, when people are in the office. We're seeing that this enables women to actually be in the workforce longer, especially through periods of time where they have young children. We're seeing that for neurodivergent folk, that's actually giving them a break from overly stimulated workplaces where they struggle to get things like deep work done. And I'm very sure there are other segments, people of color and things like that, where we're actually able to create more accessibility to work by allowing for these geographically dispersed ecosystems of work to play out. So I'm really hopeful that in 2024 and beyond, we'll continue to develop workplaces where inclusion and diversity and equity is better baked into our systems, because we're finally, some of the organizations we work with are finally ready to unpack sort of the patriarchal systems that have got us to this point. And to me, that's so encouraging. We really need to be doing both.
Okay, I'm so glad that you brought that up as far as what the standard is set for workplace, and that there's the specific set standard as far as patriarchal standard that everyone has to adhere to. So my question to you all is, what are some of the pitfalls that you would warn your clients about to make sure that they can actively dismantle this system so that everyone can feel included? Alexis, you've kind of answered on this, so why don't you go ahead?
Look, I'd love to hear what Rhonda and Chikere have to say on this, but I think, it's really important that when we unpack these systems, that we have all voices on the table with this as well. Typically, I've heard this from a DEI speaker in the past as well, so I don't want to claim this as my own, but she said to me, the master's key will never dismantle the master's house. So it's really important that... Yes, I know, right? So it's really important that we have diversity of voices in the unpacking of these systems, so we can understand how the current systems actually impact everyone at all levels. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really interested to hear what the other two have to say on this as well.
Yeah,
of course.
Definitely. Well, I'll say safety as well. I think, that whole psychological safety really is important. I think if employees, if organizations, if they don't feel safe, how does change happen? Right. And we need to have those brave and bold conversations about everything, unfortunately. Okay. And I think another thing that I find really important is education, and people need to realize that, the journey that we are all on when we're looking at DEIB is an ongoing journey, a journey that never ever ends. This is not a checkbox or tick box exercise. We're not just going to, switch off whatever we're doing because we're finished. We never finish. It's continuous process. So I'll definitely say, that safety, the education, making sure all voices are heard, and really be intentional about what needs to be achieved.
Okay, Rhonda, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'm going to piggyback on the safety component. One of the things that we have found in our work is often the term DEI or the term diversity in particular, people shut down. So if they're part of the dominant culture, the first thought is, that's not me. That doesn't involve me. So I'm going to shut down. Or they'll feel like, okay, they're going to point fingers at me. And it wasn't really me. It was, however long ago. So what we do, there's a client, a biotech company that we started doing some work with. And our first programming with them was built around storytelling and active listening and how to be empathetic, because some of those soft skills definitely have a place. So if we're able to tell our stories and feel comfortable telling our stories and feel like, okay, this is a safe space for me, then we're going to start being able to make some true progress versus starting with, the unconscious bias and implicit bias. And sometimes people don't respond well to that approach. So try to shift our approach there with exercises, activities, and programming that helps people look inward first versus putting up those barriers, because we know with those barriers, we're not going to make any progress at all.
Actually, I'm glad. I want to talk about something that you just spoke about leaders being kind of sensitive about certain things. I want to go back to an interview I saw with you with Stacey Tuschel, and you had brought up the point. This was a few years back. You brought up the point that sometimes leaders and organizations and businesses are too afraid to post things about race and sexism and whatnot on their social media because they're saying, I don't want to pander. I don't want to become a pander. So like, what are some of the ways that you can what are some of the practices that you give to your clients so that they can ease into this or just go into this with a little bit more bravery so they can make a safe space for everyone?
Right. Well, first off, many clients, they can be polarized or not know, okay, what do I say? I don't want to offend. I don't want to do the wrong thing. So they do nothing. So that's an issue that has to be overcome. But in terms of that interview, I think where I was going with that was that with leaders, you really need to be able to say, okay, we're going to take a stance. And just by sheer virtue of retaining a DEI team or bringing in a DEI professional on your staff, it shows that, hey, we're serious about this, putting time, resources, money behind this. So be brave because you've already taken the first step. Don't worry about people saying, oh, you're pandering, because you are actually doing the work. Where that pandering comes in, and we've seen this, where an organization has, their ERGs listed on their website and vision statement. And then you speak to the folks within the organization and they're like, are we I didn't know. Yeah. That will backfire eventually. So an organization really, if they're going to put that type of information out there, they need to stand behind it. And again, for those leaders that are brave enough to say, okay, yeah, we are going to do this. I am going to put that statement out there. They are already doing the work.
Right.
And that's the key thing. Isn't it? I think a lot of the times, a lot of leaders, they just don't know enough, okay? And they feel scared. Because that's what I've found. I've noticed, especially, in the region I work in, is that they just don't know enough. And I think they shut down and they rather not say anything, okay? Right. Because as Rhonda was saying, it's like, oh, I might say something, might say the wrong thing. Or as they say in the UK, I might put my foot in it. They say that an awful lot. But that's a problem if, they just don't know enough.
Mm-hmm. But we also, to your point, we teach people that, hey, you are going to make mistakes. I mean, the eye's broad, right?
All the time.
Yeah. So if you look at all of the diversity dimensions and social identities, it's possible to know everything about everyone and everybody's.
Exactly.
It depends on how you respond when you do make those.
Exactly.
And being gracious and it's being, okay,
exactly.
I wasn't aware. Exactly. Let me learn more. And showing, again, that kind of goes back to my earlier comment about that vulnerability, being able to say, yeah, oh, I didn't know. And that is very difficult for many leaders to say, I don't know. So
totally.
Those skills that we definitely promote and teach within our programs.
Yes. And it's so funny you said that because I do that a lot. I tell them as well. I say, don't let the fear of making a mistake prevent you from your journey. And I also say, if you make a mistake, as you said, apologize, treat it as a learning moment, because completely immersed in the topic, but I still make mistakes. We all do. So, I love that.
All right. Thank you all for that. Alexis, do you have any thoughts?
I love what I'm hearing. And I think it speaks to what we call it human leaders is like the intention impact gap. And I think it's so often that organizations and leaders have fantastic intentions around DEI and other strategies, but how it's actually landing to their people isn't always the case. And that might be by virtue of breakdown in the behaviors that people actually experience in the workplace, or that the systems in place aren't actually allowing for these intentions to filter through into how people are working. So certainly the bulk of our work is centered around generally working with the individual leader to close their intention impact gap. So we always encourage leaders to have those difficult conversations. And I think it was Rhonda that mentioned it. It's about creating a level of comfort with discomfort, I think, for leaders. And that really requires some radically candid conversations with the people you have in your team, and you to actually hold space for things that might not feel and hear well for you when you're hearing them. Because so often we think what we're doing is well-intentioned, and then that's when we can get really defensive when we're being told, actually, that's not the experience I'm having as a female in your organization, or that's not the experience I'm having as a person of color. I think safety and psychological safety in particular is something we hear a lot about in this space now, but it's not always the lived experience for our people. So I think it's really important that to create that, we actually have to go through the stage of trust and the stages of discomfort to actually create a space where that's possible. So that's what we call the intention impact gap. And it really requires us to gain perspective and to have challenging conversations and to give space to our employees to share their experiences so we can understand where we're going wrong or where we're missing the mark in terms of what we want to be doing and what's actually the lived experience of our people.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I actually, I want to ask you all a question because I think, me personally, I'm not necessarily sure on the data behind this, but I feel as though unconscious bias is a major issue that easily gets overlooked. How do you all tackle unconscious bias with your clients? Let's start with you, Chikere.
I think it really is important for everyone to know that we all have bias. It's that I don't think anyone should be afraid of it. And I always say to my client, if especially if I do, so for example, if I do one of my allyship programs, we need to address our biases because bias is out there, it's rife. So when I talk about bias, I talk about the fact that we all have bias. I talk about, what influences our biases. If you think about the world and what influences it, and there's no shame in having bias. The only shame is not, doing something to stop that bias, and, as I've mentioned to you all, I come from a recruitment background. So you can imagine affinity bias is rife in recruitment, right? Where we tend to navigate towards people like us, So for example, even up to last week, went to see a client. He took me round the department. And again, it was almost like he was hiring lots of mini-me's, and it's a case of how do we get rid of that, essentially? So just, explaining what bias is, how it affects our actions, and how we can, hopefully try and be aware of our bias. And, education really is important. So I always, make sure that when I end anything I'm doing, I will give them either a book to read or listen to or something to watch or some bite-sized information. But just letting people know that there's no shame in having biases, okay? Recognize what bias you have and really try and act on it, and I think that's, that's what I do because I'm biased. I know I am, so that's what's really, really important.
Right. I appreciate the honesty.
Within our, if you don't mind, I'll just add a few comments here. With our unconscious bias training programs, there's a good portion dedicated to the science behind unconscious bias because there's tons of research and data that shows us that bias is based on how our brain operates. So to Kira's point, it's okay to say, yeah, I have bias. I might like people who went to the same school I went to, or people that have a similar upbringing, from my Midwestern upbringing, who knows? But the point is to identify or accept the fact that it's okay. And then identify those times when you see that bias creeping in, and then have those strategies in place to mitigate that bias. So again, it's bias on its surface sounds like, oh my God, it's a dirty word. But if you take a step back, really understand it, understand why it occurs, then you can effectively address it, I believe.
Alexis, any thoughts?
I'll keep this real quick. Unconscious bias is a challenging one. And to Rhonda's point, obviously, it's a psychological mechanism that we innately possess as human beings to process information in the world around us. So the tricky thing with unconscious bias is it's just that. It's unconscious to the individual. So I think at best what we can do is really educate and inform people that this is something that we possess. However, the real checking mechanism is when we allow for other people to give us perspective. So again, if we're intentionally trying to do something and the impact is not aligned with that, we actually rely on those around us to help keep checking us when it comes to bias, because I don't necessarily see when I have an affinity toward or like myself, whether that's other women, other people from my LUM, it doesn't really matter. I can't see that because it's just how my brain is processing the information. So I think it goes back to my point that we need to have diverse people at the table, because we can't check what we can't see. And for a lot of us, it's an unconscious bias that's living in our unconscious. So we actually need diverse perspective, so we're able to actually check that in ourselves.
All right, thank you. So, of course, speaking about, diversity and, of course, unconscious bias and having more people at the table, this would lead into my next question about the difference between equality versus equity, which is something that can get muddled a lot of the times. Rhonda, you spoke on this beautifully. So if you wouldn't mind, if you all could explain the difference between equity versus equality. So Rhonda, please.
Yeah, and there's some really good, whether it's videos that you can find on YouTube or even just some illustrations that I think do an incredible job of what equality is versus equity. But equality, everybody does the same thing. You get an M&M, you get an M&M, and you get an M. Or equity is getting what you need. So instead of giving 3 people M&Ms, maybe one person is a diabetic, so you're not going to give them an M&M. So it's really understanding what that person needs and providing them what they need. And Chikere, you want to that?
Exactly what you said was right. So when you look at equality, as you mentioned, it's given everybody the exact same resources. But equity means given resources based on their needs. And that's a great example of the M&M. Another example is a bicycle. If you give everybody a bike, exactly the same bike, and if you think could be a child, a tall man, a shorter lady, and a person in a wheelchair, if you give them all the exact same bike, what's going to happen? So we need to make sure they have a bike to suit their needs, really. So yeah, Rhonda, you explain that. That's literally it.
That's one of my favorite. I think I
love that one. Yeah. You know what I'm talking about.
Because it shows it right there. You see that and you say, okay.
Exactly.
And it makes sense. It's not like, hey, what is there to disagree with or refute? It illustrates it beautifully.
That is great.
We use that particular illustration in our work as well.
Yeah.
Because I do think it's spot on.
Yeah.
This actually really reminds me of a saying I once heard. If you take a fish out of water to try to get it to climb a tree, it's always going to think that it's stupid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that really does explain equity. It explains this and sums it up, but these are really, really great. So so what are some things or what are some practices that you would all suggest your clients to make a more equitable workspace for employees so that they all can feel included and feel like they have support and they have, the right tools they need to succeed in their careers? Alexis, let's start with you.
Thank you. I just want to say firstly, Rhonda and Chikere did such a good job of explaining that. And the reason I love that is because, and they'll both probably be able to speak to this as well, but the conversation of privilege can be a really hard one to have in organizations because it feels really affronting when people say, you're privileged because, and as a white woman, I appreciate that I have privileges afforded to me that other people in the room quite often don't. And so what I think is really good about equity is it kind of flips that conversation on its head. It's not about me having to recognize what's challenging for me and say that, yes, I have all these things that other people don't. It's just about understanding what each individual needs to thrive and making sure that we can provide that so they can do their best possible work. So I love those explanations because I think it removes the need to have that privilege conversation, which is still obviously really important. but I think it allows people to be brought on the journey of the equity conversation a lot more. So I really love that. And I think to that point, it's really about, and I guess it goes to some of the work that we do, which is understanding some of the work structures that people need to thrive. And I think there's an important opportunity for us to start really breaking down sort of historic, I recall in the past, like HR teams, if they're hiring for a job, there's a job description. The parameters are really clear about how, where, and why that job will be performed and in what way. And I think there's an opportunity for organizations to get flexible now or rethink that approach, if you will, to understand the outputs of the job, but rethink how and where and why that should be done in a certain way. And by doing so, we're actually creating the space for people with different backgrounds, with different geographies, with different neurodivergent needs, different stages of life, again, mothers, parents, to be able to enter the conversation and say, well, I have the skills and I have the capacity to perform this job, but I can't do it 5 days a week, 9 to 5 in a workplace because I have small children and perhaps I'm a single parent, or perhaps I don't. I don't know, whatever it may be. So I think that's a really exciting place for us to be right now in terms of equity, is really getting to understand how work can look and focusing more on the output and the capacity that people have to contribute to our organizations, rather than putting these really tight structures around how they need to be doing things and that sort of fairly outdated expectation now.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. So I guess moving forward in 2024, what are some things that worry you about what organizations are doing or what they're not doing as far as a DE&I and human leadership and, including people and being more inclusive as far as race? I know me and Chikere, we spoke briefly about, not having representation or proper representation. And I know that when you have me personally, in my own experience, being a Black man in an all-white space, I can feel isolated and I can feel like an outcast. And that's not necessarily anybody's fault individually, but it's a part of the system. So, do you feel at all that this is maybe a hindrance, or this is something that we still struggle with today? If not, what are the struggles that you've all noticed? Chikere, can we start with you?
Yes. Have you got time? Oh my goodness. I just as I mentioned, the work I do, I love doing the work I do, but I get to this time of the year and I sort of reflect on how the year has been and what's happened. And I think there's still a very, very long way to go. When we talk about diversity, come on, I'm a Black woman, right? My husband's Black, my sons are Black, right? I would talk about race. It's something I will do. I would talk about, Black and brown people, right? I will think about my sons who will be entering the workforce in the next, 5-6 years. And it's what's going to happen, right? And I've noticed that, especially in the UK, talking about race makes people feel very, very uncomfortable, okay? And these are senior leaders for global firms who are still learning, or still afraid to even have that conversation. And honestly, it is scary. I am scared. Okay, I was speaking to somebody yesterday in a workshop who told me that racism doesn't exist, and the more we have the conversation around it, he said to me, this is the problem. Us constantly having the conversation around it is that is the problem. Okay, and I think maybe because I know too much, because I'm working in a space and I'm hearing people. But it does make me feel really, really scared. And this is why we need people like every single one of you, okay, using your platform to create change, having conversations, and just going out there and doing what needs to be done, okay? In the UK, a lot of women are in HR. A lot of white women are in HR, okay? And it's a case of, how can they do more, right? How can they use their platform to create change? Okay, I still have people saying to me, I can't find any diverse talent. And it's what are you talking about? Tell me more. There's no Black or brown talent out there.
Right.
There's none. All right, really? None at all. I've looked. And when they talk about Black and brown talent, they talk about, council estates. And it's okay, tell me, where have you looked? Okay. So
Right.
even though we're having a conversation, so yes, it is, we've moved on, but I think there's still more we can do. Okay. And I'll be honest with you, it does get me scared because sometimes I wonder, what's going to happen in the future. I do. I really want, and as I mentioned, we're talking about AI before
Right.
the other two ladies came on. And if we don't have diverse, if we don't have diverse programmers, right? If we have the same type of people doing the programming, what's going to happen? For me, that's a bigger threat when we talk about artificial intelligence.
What's so fascinating about that, I had a conversation just yesterday around this and around the baked-in bias in AI and the way that this particular computer scientist explained it to me was that AI is an algorithmic expression of someone's interpretation of the world around them. And it just slapped me in the face because I thought, oh my gosh, I'd never considered that there's a human being creating that. We see AI as like the coming of the robots, it's like this conceptual thing that we think there's no human beings on the end of that. But if we're pulling data from historical, internet-based forms and data sheets and news stories and all of these kinds of things, then we're continuing to bake in the same systematic racism, discrimination, and bias that we've always had. So I think that's certainly one piece of the changing work puzzle. And we know that there will be more and more roles automated and more roles that will be interconnected with AI as an enabler for human outcomes. And I think it's absolutely critical at all levels, at an organizational level. But I really believe there needs to be government regulation and reform around AI. And mechanisms in place to keep AI companies accountable to how their technology actually checks for bias, how regularly, because these systems are learning as they go. So they can also, from one year to the next, learn bias that wasn't present in the technology the year previously. So I certainly think that's one piece of it. Again, I will only speak to my experience here and in the work that we do. One of my biggest frustrations, and I must say that I am very hopeful because a lot of organizations that we work with are genuinely trying to overhaul their practices so that DEI is not a tick box. However, I do frustratingly still get clients, and typically they're bigger corporates or big government organizations who have to meet a certain criteria of diversity, equity, inclusion, things as such. And so they want to do the work, but they don't really want to have to do the work. And I think that to me is really frustrating because I think, to your point, Julian, around being, the only Black man in a room of white men, that might be the diverse tokenistic box ticked, but do you feel included? Do you feel belonging as a human being? Are you seen for your value and actually given the capacity to thrive? Because I'm not okay with that. And I hope that other leaders are also beginning to see that it's not about just having X amount of people of color in the room and, one person of neurodivergence on the team. It's actually about how do we then create the space where that human being can do their best work, feel safe to do their best work, and we can really get the benefits of human beings being at their best through that, because we know that there are incredible benefits to productivity, to creativity, to innovation. But there's the moral imperative. Like we're all human beings and we want people to thrive through their work. We know that work is a protective factor for mental health and well-being for people when done right. And so I think there's just this beautiful opportunity for us to not just tick boxes, but actually say, how do we make work safe and inclusive as well so that human beings can actually thrive? That would benefit our communities, our families.
Yes.
It's just, we're on the precipice of such an incredible opportunity if we choose to do it the right way. So I'm both hopeful.
Just really quickly, I'm not going to mention any names, but somebody sent an article to me. It was in the Forbes, and it's a billionaire tech guy who recently bought a platform, and he said DEI must die, and criticizes diversity schemes as discrimination.
Yeah, but that's the patriarchy speaking, is it not?
Okay, so
it's really easy to say from his he who shall not be named's position, right? It's super easy to say that, of course.
Cool. Of course, but that person
Because why did he feel threatened? Why did he feel like he had to say that in the first place?
But you know something, Rhonda, a lot of leaders, when I do my leadership, when I coach them, they tell me that. A lot of them are saying, a lot of white leaders, they are scared.
Because it's hard.
They feel
threatening.
Yeah, absolutely. Because who wants to give up that power that has just been built in for them to continue to pass on? That's, that's part of the issue.
Yeah.
And that to me is scary too.
Yeah.
Can I share just one last thing that I get concerned on? And it I think it was mentioned before, but just this type of work takes work. There's investment. It has to be a priority. What I don't like is when we start working with an organization and I'll say, have you done any DEI training or programs? And they'll say, oh, we did an online module. And it's like, you've got to get people in a room talking to each other. DEI is about connectivity, and how can we connect, and how can we collaborate, and how can we work alongside each other. And just by doing a 30-minute module online is not going to make a difference. So,
agreed. Love it.
It's like from the one who's in power standpoint, when the person that they're lording over is fighting for equity and equality, of course it's going to feel like oppression. Of course it's going to feel like oppression, because they're saying, I need you to work with me and stop stepping on my neck. So of course. Mm-hmm. But Rhonda, I actually going back to that interview that you had with Stacey Tuchel, something that you said that really stuck out to me is that what your organization does is that you look into your organizations and what their policies are. And that's really the root of, I feel like, a lot of problematic and just issues that come with diversity and inclusion. So how do you lead these clients into changing up their policies and making actionable policies that they can continue to do and just not be performative and just one year we're going to work on this, but then they completely and totally forget about it?
Right. Yeah, we do an equity audit. So we look at practices, policies, and procedures, and we really do a deep dive. And then we share our findings back with the client, and we include our recommendations. I applaud those organizations that decide to take that step, because sometimes it doesn't make an organization look really good. I mean, whether you're doing a gender audit or pay, there's a lot of things that we can uncover that are a bit unsavory for individuals outside of the dominant culture. So we welcome the opportunity to help organizations, again, really do a deep dive, take a look at everything from A to Z, and identify, okay, how can we make these policies more equitable for everyone? So everybody gets the type of bike that they need to be successful.
Love that.
That is super, very, very, very much important. Something that I really liked that I looked up, Alexis, this is going to be tossed at you. Something that I really liked about your platform or your organization. I was watching one of your discussions, how to bring more human into the workplace, and you brought up a graph that talked about understanding yourself, understanding others, and radical responsibility. How do you work with clients? Take me through that. Say I'm a client, take me through that, and how can I apply that, say, to my own organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we begin our leadership development journey to human leadership with people by getting to know themselves first. So that's what we call the self-leadership piece. And to do this, we really need people to be willing to develop what we call the internal self-awareness. So understanding themselves better, understanding what we call their emotional wisdom. So effectively using their emotions, understanding them, but also using them. And lastly, empowered agency. And this is an important one that we often find. What's so fascinating about empowered agency, it dives into the research that stems from locus of control. And we find that a lot of folks in organizations who aren't in formal positions of power often don't recognize their influence as well. So this can be a really interesting for people in the DEI space to get some clarity around where they can do things to help shift the needle in their organization if they're seeing things that they're not happy with and they would like to see change. Because we know that each of us have power. Perhaps it's not, running the organization, but we can, through our relationships, through the way that we work, through the conversations we have, actually influence change in those around us. So that's where we begin with our human leadership journey with people, understanding yourself, doing the self-leadership piece. And we really believe that it's not until you do that you can actually effectively lead others. And within this component of human leadership, it really looks at how we communicate, how we cultivate connections, so how we build relationships in a way that is psychologically safe, that shows people that we're trustworthy, reliable, and that we're worthy of leading people. Because again, we also don't believe leadership is a formal position. We believe it's a way of being and a set of behaviors, and that the premise of leadership is to serve those human beings around us. So once you know yourself, once you do the self-leadership piece, then we move into the leading others piece. And then finally, we end with what we call radical responsibility. And that's really taking continuous ownership of how we show up in the world. So it's closing that intention impact gap. It's having those hard, uncomfortable conversations over and over again. As Chikere said, DEI and leadership isn't a one and done. It's not, I got the job and that's my job done. It's really about having the perseverance and the discipline to continually rethink and evolve how we lead so that we can meet the needs of our team members. So that radical responsibility piece is really about continuing that journey, and as we peel back the layers of ourselves as an individual, we realize how much more and more there is to actually learn about ourselves, and the capacity we have to really grow and develop as evergreen. So that's really, in a 1 minute nutshell, human leadership looks like us, but we know that this is a precursor to outcomes like DEI in an organization. If you don't have leaders that are on board with growth and that are on board with having hard and challenging and confronting conversations, and they don't see the value in empathizing with human beings and wanting to create a safe space for human beings, that's where the policy change and everything else can fall flat. You have to have people ready to lead from a human first place.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. Okay, so we have about time for one more question. Thank you. I've got a lot of gems from this. Our audience has gotten a lot of gems from you all. So this question is for all of you. So say I have a startup, right? What would be some things that you would suggest to me or give me advice on how to leverage my DE&I initiatives, how to be more inclusive, and how to be a strong and a good leader for my employees? Chikere, let's start with you.
So I would say, first and foremost, think about your why. Okay, why is it important? Why is diversity important to you? And I think also think about your what do you think you want to achieve and how will you achieve it? Okay. And again, it's going back to the moral case, isn't it? We know the moral case and we know the business case for diversity, but also like what we spoke about the next generation, didn't we? Generation Z, Generation Z, those who are coming into the workforce, right? And, as Rhonda and Alexis mentioned, we all know the benefits of diversity. We all know why diversity is good. So start to think about, as a leader, why is this conversation important? What do I need to achieve? How am I going to achieve it? Okay. And then make sure you have a team around you, right? Who is willing, okay, to help support you. And I think also it really is important that everybody knows that is everybody's responsibility. Okay. And that's the key thing. Everybody. Not just, the one marginalized person within your organization, not just the person who decides to focus on DEI, not just a leader, just knowing that it's everybody's responsibility and just knowing that it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey of learning, unlearning, relearning, and as you heard, there've been mistakes made along the way, but it's a case of, making sure that you are really you really want to make sure that journey is, impactful. Okay. So really think about what needs to be achieved. And I think that's the key thing. And think about all that work you have to put in. And I keep saying, I had people say to me, I haven't got time for this. I have people say to me, Chikere, teach me how to recruit diverse talent. And it's like, what do you want me to do? Write an A4 sheet of paper. This is what you've got to do. Where the point is, You have got to put the hard work in yourself. So I think the key thing is that, leaders need to know that they've got to be in it for their long haul, really. And I also say don't feel afraid. There's a lot of fear, especially around, the majority groups, I speak to them all the time and they think, they're going to lose their power or their privilege or something. So I think just making sure that they know they shouldn't be afraid at all.
Okay, Rhonda, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I actually participated, Business Insider ran a program where they partnered our company with a startup. And they said, okay, you're going to support this startup with regards to their DEI strategy. So I had a series of meetings with the CEO and a few other stakeholders. One of the challenging things was that CEO is like, I don't have time for this. I've got this, that, and the other going on. I just don't have time. However, that's when you need to make the time. When you're in the startup phases, that's when you're going to be implementing those equitable practices, policies, and procedures versus wait until you already have those set up and say 5 years later, oh gosh, okay, let's do an equity audit. Let's build it in from day one. And just realizing that as a startup, you might have 10 people, but those 10 people, DEI is important to them. So my response is to always start earlier. It should be one of the first steps for any startup.
Thank you for that. So start early. Always start early as soon as you can. Alexis, how about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I love everything that's been said here. So I'll keep it brief. I think being a startup, you have a fantastic opportunity to really embed this into your cultural fabric from the get-go. So do take that opportunity. As both of our panelists here has mentioned, work that we do really looks at a value set. This is the time in the organization where they're setting values and they're talking about what's important to them and why. What we urge companies to do and what we often work with them to do from that is once they've got that value set, build that out into what we call operating principles. So these are the behaviors that actually underpin how or why we do things around here. And when you're doing that, be conscious of embedding DEI into that. So if you're serious about DEI, we do that with the entire team. So we work with startups of, 10 plus people, and we involve everyone in that conversation. What does the value of speak with integrity mean to you? What are the actual behaviors that underpin that? And have we got behaviors in there that reflect how important DEI is to us as an organization? So I would say break down the key behaviors that underpin your values and make sure that there's DEI very firmly embedded into that. And that's going to help your culture scale with DEI as well.
All right. I love all of these answers. And with that, thank you all so very much. We got some great gems, some great people. Of course, this is Julian Griffin with cakedotcom, and we have just talked about the future of work and how we've reflected on DE&I in 2023 and what we have to look forward in 2024. So please, if you all let us know how we can get a hold of you, how we can find you and find your organizations, please let us know. Rhonda.
I'm at elevateddiversity.com, and all of our contact information is right there on our website.
Alexis?
You can find us at www.wearehumanleaders.com. We also have a podcast called We Are Human Leaders that streams on major platforms, and we have beautiful conversations with experts from around the world very regularly on there.
Thank you. Chikere, where can we find you?
Okay, inclusive.co.uk. Inclusive has got 2 C's in it.
All right. Thank you all so much. This has been really, really great. Thank you guys so much again for taking the time out of your busy schedules. My name is Julian Griffin, and we'll see you all next time.